Okay. That is one of my, for those teacher education students in the audience, that's one of my classroom management strategies there. You know, ask students to start applauding, right? And they'll give you their attention, maybe. I don't know. Welcome. My name is Rich Milner, and I am the Helen Faison Professor of Urban Education and Director of the Center for Urban Education here at the University of Pittsburgh. Here at CUE, our vision is to be a space of learning and sharing with communities to positively transform educational opportunities and experiences. One of the ways we try to create those transformative experiences is through our biannual CUEtalks lecture series. This year, our theme is Connecting Communities in Schools, and we are pleased to welcome Dr. Kenneth Zeichner to Pitt to present a CUEtalks lecture that focuses on this topic. Dr. Zeichner is the Boeing Professor of Teacher Education at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is former Vice President of the American Educational Research Association, an elected member of the National Academy of Education, and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, as well as the National Education Policy Center at the University of Colorado. He received the Legacy Award from AERA's Division K and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education in 2009. A Philadelphia native, I would say welcome home, but not quite, right? And former elementary teacher in Syracuse, New York, Ken was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1976 to 2009. He has spent much of his 41 years in education directing teacher education programs, including 12 years as director of the Madison Professional Development Schools Partnership in Madison, Wisconsin. Any tweeters out there? Tweeters, right? You know, do you do Twitter? We don't do Twitter anymore? Pretty sad, pretty sad. But for those of you who do tweet, I hope you will tweet throughout Ken's lecture. Ken has also been engaged in a number of projects designed to improve teacher education both nationally and internationally. His new book, The Struggle for the Soul of Teacher Education, will be published later this year. I can't wait to get my copy. Please join me in welcoming to the podium our featured speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Ken Zeichner.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so it's great to be back. I think it's safe to say this in my home state of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, they have their differences. But I'm in my home state of Pennsylvania, and it's great to be here. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, as Rich alluded to. I spent 13 years as a student in the Philadelphia Public Schools, or what used to be the Philadelphia Public Schools before it became a recovery district, followed by 4 years of undergraduate work at Temple University before I left the state of Pennsylvania. This is actually, I think I counted, it's my 40th year as a university teacher educator. And before that, I was an elementary teacher and a school-based teacher educator. I do a lot, now that I've been around a while, of thinking back over my career in terms of the issues that have been fundamentally important to me, that I've been struggling on for the whole 40 years. And so I decided to focus this talk tonight on one of those. One theme in my work and in my life has been the engagements of families and communities in schools and in the preparation of teachers of their children. My public school teaching experience took place in Syracuse. I taught in 2 elementary schools. They were public community schools. There was a lot of unrest across the country back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The communities that I went into were primarily African American communities where there had been a lot of dissatisfaction about the quality of education offered to children in those schools. And so when I came in, there was a new governance structure put in place where the community helped govern the school and where teachers who taught in the school were expected to reach out to families and communities in positive ways. I was required to visit with the families of my students, all of them before the school year even started. The community was in the school hiring and evaluating teachers, and it was that's the life I know as a public school teacher, that the public schools belong to the communities, and they have a right to have a voice in the education of their children. During that time, I became involved in the National Teacher Corps, which was, and this is a photo from one of those schools, Martin Luther King Elementary. It's a more recent photo, but it is the Martin Luther King Elementary where I taught for part of my career. I became involved in the National Teacher Corps, which was a program that grew out of an earlier program in Washington, D.C. It was part of the first Higher Education Act in the United States in 1965. This program was designed to prepare teachers for high poverty urban and rural schools. And one of the defining characteristics of the program was that the community was central in the preparation of teachers. I was hired out of my classroom, I stayed in my school, and I supervised a team of interns, not only observing their work in the classroom, but also they had to live in the community where they were learning to teach. That was a requirement of the program, and they had to spend about a quarter of their time doing projects cooperatively out in the community. And so part of my responsibilities was to evaluate that work. And so both with my teaching experience and experience as a teacher educator, it is just right to me, and it has always been the case, that the community should play an important part in what goes on in public schools and in the preparation of teachers for those schools. It is very clear from the literature that teachers need to know about the communities where their students grow and develop, how to develop respectful and trusting connections with students' families and other adults in students' communities, and how to make use of this knowledge in ways that support student learning, how to help connect students' lives outside of school with their lives in school. It is also very clear in reading the literature that although learning to work with families and communities and community-based learning have been articulated as important goals for teacher education for over 60 years, that there has only been minimal attention to both the preparation of teachers to work with families and communities and to community-based learning in a teacher education program. So there was, you noticed in my title, essential but elusive. So there's been a lot of rhetoric about it, but it's not been attended to in any significant way. Couple of assertions. I would assert that schools cannot teach children well if teachers lack an understanding of their students' cultures and lives, and if they lack meaningful relationships with their families. This is something I think there's a lot of support for, and it's necessary. It's not something to figure out how to fit it in to a crowded program, but without this, I don't believe teachers can be successful. Bridging the community and school divide is an essential element of a larger struggle to make schools more equitable and just for many students living in poverty. We have huge gaps and opportunities to learn in education, public education. I experienced some of that myself in Philadelphia public schools. This says that it's essential, but it's also not enough. In fact, I do not believe that any educational intervention of any kind, at all by itself, is enough to overcome these gaps and opportunities to learn in inequity in schools. That it's part of a larger struggle for social justice, and that we also must deal with poverty and its effects and provide the social preconditions for learning, as some countries have figured out how to do. And so the promise that including this one, I think the role of communities is essential, but we need to deal with poverty as well. Many teachers, this is another assumption, enter schools without a real understanding of students' lives out of schools. And when you look at who's going into teaching and who's in the public schools, there's a huge gap between the experiences of the predominantly white English-speaking teaching force and the now majority students of color who attend public schools. So many teachers do not live in the communities that they teach in. and they go into these communities, parachuted in, as I like to say, in many cases, to try to save children from their communities instead of working for and with the communities. I would assert that communities have an important role to play in the education of the teachers of their children. And in fact, I would further assert that universities or alternative programs like Teach for America are incapable by ourselves to educate teachers without the cooperation and support of the community and without accessing the expertise in communities. Those are pretty strong statements. I'm going to try to defend those in the next few minutes. James Comer has been a professor of child psychiatry at Yale University's School of Medicine's Child Study Center since 1968. And as far as I can tell, he's still there. During these years, he has concentrated his career on promoting a focus on child development as a way to improve schools. Comer is best known in education for founding the Comer School Development Program in 1968, which promotes collaboration of parents, educators, and communities to improve social, emotional, and academic outcomes for students. And his concept of teamwork between community and school has improved educational outcomes for students in the more than 500 Comer schools that have existed around the country. Comer's feeling is that the stark reality, as he said, of many urban schools is one of isolation and disconnection from the neighborhoods that they serve, essentially as fortresses within the communities that are looked upon negatively. There are exceptions to this, of course, but he says this is sort of the general picture in urban education. 1988, the city of Chicago, which has been one of the most controversial and troubled districts in the history of the country, implemented a policy of local community councils in schools. Tony Bright and Barbara Schneider, as well as a host of researchers in Chicago, they studied 12 of the elementary schools that had brought the community into the schools. And then they identified schools that had been successful in improving and those that had not. And they tried to figure out, like, why is it that some of these schools were successful and some of them were not? And what it came down to was trust, including trust between the school and community. I want to read one quote here that sort of encapsulates, I think, the importance of preparing teachers to be able to work with and for families and communities. They conclude, again, thinking upon the information collected from these 12 successful schools and then looking in a more holistic way at Chicago, distrust now characterizes many of the social interactions that poor families have with local schools and other public institutions. Teachers often see parents' goals and values as impediments to students' academic accomplishments. Parents, in turn, believe that teachers are antagonistic toward them and fail to appreciate the actual conditions that shape children's lives. This lack of trust between teachers and parents, often exacerbated by race and class differences, makes it difficult for these groups to maintain a genuine dialogue about shared concerns. The resultant miscommunications tends to reinforce existing prejudices and undermines constructive efforts by teachers and parents to build ties around the interests of children. Instead of working together to support the academic and social development of students, teachers and parents find themselves operating in isolation, or in worst cases, in opposition to one another, unless substantial attention focuses on strengthening the social relationships among school professionals and parents. Efforts at instructional improvement are unlikely to succeed. And I think my own observation and experience when I moved to Seattle in 2009, one of the first things I did was to got involved with a group that we had meeting with tribal leaders, the many tribes in Washington State. It's a major part of the state are the indigenous people. And they, I can remember a meeting out in a lodge where the dean came with me, and we were hearing a lot about how the teachers that are produced from the institutions in the state don't understand their children. They don't really support their children. There's a lot of negativity out in communities about public schools. And again, there are exceptions to that, but it's real important to them that the schools really listen to them and understand them as part of the, and so I go along with Breiken Schneider, and I argue this is an essential part of teacher preparation, and if done right, will lead to schools that are more responsive to the communities they're intended to serve. In teacher education, unfortunately, the status quo is that the subject of working with families and communities and learning about communities is rarely addressed in teacher preparation programs. And it's one of the areas when new teachers are asked how well they were prepared. There are a couple areas that stand out: teaching English learners and working with families and communities as areas they feel least prepared in. So teacher education hasn't taken this cause up. But there are examples in history of schools that have been what Leonard Covello calls community-centered schools. Covello was an Italian immigrant who was a teacher and principal in two New York City high schools in East Harlem between 1913 and 1956. Covello built on his own experience as an Italian immigrant attending New York City public schools, and he developed commitments to cultural pluralism and the importance of immigrant children becoming conscious and proud of their native cultures while learning to adapt to a new environment. As a principal, he succeeded in implementing a concept, the community-centered school, which provided social and cultural context for the education of Italian and later Puerto Rican children. Covello turned Franklin High School in East Harlem, where he was principal for 22 years, into one of the leading examples of community-centered education. This concept, based on the recognition of public school, this public school is the one social agency which touches nearly all families. And it calls for a complete interaction between the school and the community. Walking through the school's community, becoming known, trusted, working through an advisory council, and working on projects that were not only education projects, but projects, broader projects in the community, were an important part of his work at that school. Housing programs, for instance. He hired teachers who were committed to this concept of community-centered education. Most of the education of those teachers took place on the job in his school, rather than in their teacher education programs. He did things, he believed that there should be a greater connection between the in-school of education of students during the day in classrooms and their education and after-school programs in the community. And oftentimes, and I'm always struck by how disconnected, even after-school programs that take place in the same physical building of the school, there's very little communication between classroom teachers and the community-based educators. And so his goal as a principal, Covello, was one model for a leader of a community-based school. Vanessa Siddle Walker has written about Caswell County Training School, a segregated school in rural North Carolina. And the principal, Nicholas Longworth Dillard, in this school, this was a school that had very little resources. The citizens paid taxes to support schools, but this was a time during segregation where the mostly white school board wouldn't allocate any money to support the school. So they had double taxation. They paid the tax, and then they had to pay money out of their pockets for the school. But the school was considered very, very successful by the community, and they went out and put pressure on the state to provide additional resources. One key to the success of Dillard's school was the way that the staff reached out to parents and community and communicated they really cared about the success of the children. According to Vanessa Siddle Walker, perhaps the most striking way in which the school reached out was on its willingness to meet parents on their own turf. Dillard was a member of the community organization and would often walk to town after school and take the time to talk to the farmers on the corner. He sang in the local choir and spent time in a couple of the local churches.
and in the homes of the parents who lived out in the country. Visiting the community was an important part of his community, and his teachers were expected to do it in addition to him doing it himself. He expected that if his teachers worked in the community, they would make themselves known and become part of it. He wanted teachers who were accessible to the average parent. He expected teachers to visit the homes, not just when there was a problem of discipline or academic problem, but as a normal part of develop relationships with the families. And he said to his teachers, many teachers remember him saying, if you can see the circumstances out of which children have come, you will understand how to teach them. Dillard School was a second model. I don't want to romanticize segregated schools, but we can learn a lot today about the way in which that school interacted and connected with its community that I think would be valuable lessons today in a time when many schools are disconnected from their communities. I want to briefly look at, since the topic of this is on how to prepare teachers, in the ways that Dillard and Covello worked with their teachers. 1948, there was a report that came out in teacher education. It was sort of the beginning of the modern era of preparing teachers with experience. They would have some student teaching experience in the public schools. Prior to that time, they would teach in lab schools on the campuses with professors' children. And there was not very much clinical experience. But they began to send them out to schools. And the point I want to make here is from the very beginning of the idea of field experiences in the sort of modern era of teacher education, school and community experiences was the way it was defined, not just school experiences. So community experiences were felt to be important so that teachers could learn and get to know their students. To better utilize the resources and expertise in the community in support of their students' learning, and to work towards breaking down the barriers between schools and the communities by making the schools more responsive to the community. So this was like the sort of beginning of the modern era of teacher preparation. This was the vision, and there's been a lack of attention generally to it. Larry Cuban is one of the most prominent educational historians in the country. He was a teacher in the suburb of Cleveland before he went to Cardozo High School in Washington, D.C., which was then a high poverty community, and became a teacher. He writes about how he thought he could just come in with his, and he thought he was a good teacher, and he probably was. He thought he could come in just with his good teaching skills and be successful in Cardozo High School. And he published a paper in 1969 called Teacher and Community, which to me is one of the landmark papers in urban education, and I would highly recommend it. And what he talked about was how he learned that just being a good teacher who could use research-based practices and knew their content was not enough to succeed at Cardozo High School. He talked about a tripartite role of teaching: instruction, curriculum, and community involvement as necessities for teaching. And teachers need to see that their role requires active involvement and participation in the communities that they're working in and working for. Shifting the center of gravity from the university campus to the classroom and community. And that we need to model that in our teacher education programs. It's not enough just to tell people to go out and do it, but our teacher education students need to see us as teacher educators interacting with communities, accessing the expertise of communities as we educate teachers. Teacher educators tell teachers a lot of things. Go out and do this, go out and do that. Go out and teach in culturally responsive ways. But then in a lot of cases, teacher educators don't teach in culturally responsive ways. And there's a whole literature that's emerged on students of color in teacher ed programs in predominantly white universities that raises the problem of teacher educators failing to practice what they preach. There's another, and I'm going to get to some examples soon to get more concrete. Another major book in urban education For the grad students here, if you haven't read it, I think you should read it. It was one of the first books in sort of the mainstream literature that discussed the problem of racism in teacher education programs, Teachers for the Real World. That was an indictment of the dominant model of teacher education at that time. Many of the things that are asserted in that book are still true today, unfortunately. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that this book also signaled the difficulty of engaging broader communities in the preparation of teachers. Because it says even if the university wants to do this, they might find it difficult. And my own experience and reading the literature confirms it's not a matter of just bringing people in rooms. There's some restructuring of power that needs to take place. There's a re-education. You're bringing people from different worlds together, and it's not easy to do. And this was foreshadowed in 1969. Fast forwarding ahead to 2010, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to make the point that today, this 2010 was a report done, again, criticizing the way teachers are educated. And what we need to do is turn it upside down and move it more to schools. There was some nodding to the fact that teachers need to learn how to work with their colleagues and the broader community. But basically, the rest of the report, which has had a major influence on the discussion in teacher education, not only in the United States, but in some other countries, basically ignores the role of communities. In 1948, we have a report that highlights it, makes it important. In 2010, it essentially disappears. And the result, it reflects the current status of teacher preparation, which really does not provide future teachers with the kinds of preparation they need. I want to say a word about the current landscape and how teachers are prepared. We have different types of programs. This is my own way of thinking about the alternatives. About 80%, anywhere from 70 to 80% of teachers are still prepared in college and university programs. Then we have a whole set of newer programs that have come on that are partnering with colleges and universities, but they're not colleges and universities themselves. Teach for America is probably the most prominent example of this. And then there's a third type of program that is totally independent of colleges and universities, people hanging a shingle out and opening a college of education and preparing teachers on their own without any interaction with college and university. I call it independent. So the people who have come in and criticized teacher education have referred to themselves as 2.0, borrowing language from technology and innovation. They're 2.0, and we in the universities are 1.0 and obsolete. My argument is going to be that neither 1.0 or 2.0 is sufficient. What we need is 3.0. So in the 1.0, the typical university program, we have the focus is on academic knowledge, giving teachers knowledge, and then having them go out in schools mostly, in some cases, communities, and apply that knowledge when they go out. Knowledge that exists in the local communities is really ignored. And so there's this struggle and debate about the balance between the academic and the practical preparation in schools, but not many people talking about the role of communities in the education of teachers. In this 2.0 world, the education entrepreneurs, the ones that have been bankrolled by hedge fund managers and philanthropists like the Gates Foundation, the 2.0 programs, most of them focus on practice and say it's all about, there's a choice between theory and practice, it's all about practice, and some of them pride themselves in that they don't include any attention to theory. Learning theory, theory about the social context, and so on. And so they're focusing on practice, varying amounts of attention to academic knowledge, but they too pretty much ignore the local community knowledge. Teach for America is a good example of that, parachuting teachers into communities all over the country, to save children from those communities, as opposed to recognizing the resources that are there and helping to build on it in preparing teachers who can work in those communities and are committed to those communities. So what I'm going to argue is needed is a form of teacher education that does not exist to any great degree right now. I call it 3.0. It's a hybrid form of teacher education that brings together schools, universities, communities, and in some cases also teachers' associations in a collaboration and shared responsibility for the preparation of teachers. And this is, I'm going to give you some examples of that taking place. There is the emergence of the teacher residency model in the United States, and some of those programs have some of these characteristics. A number of them don't. There are teacher residency programs, for example, that parachute teachers into communities without any focus on working with and for the community, any commitment to communities. And these, I'm not criticizing the intentions of the people who are being parachuted. They mean well. But one of the things when I was director of teacher ed for up until just a few years ago at Washington, one of the first things I would talk about with teacher candidates was they need to think about why they're there, for what purpose, in relationship to the communities they're working in, and what is their level of commitment to those communities. In some cases, they did live there. In other cases, they didn't. But that is an important characteristic. To go in and try to save people from communities, a few people, I think is the wrong way to approach it. And so this idea of a hybrid space that includes local communities is something that there are some signs of developing in different places. I don't want to romanticize it. It's not eliminating power differentials. It's not like everybody gets in the room and suddenly they all smile and agree. They're going to continue to disagree. And so just moving teacher ed to schools, moving it to communities is not necessarily a solution to things. There's a lot of research, for example, that shows how in some of these so-called collaborative spaces there's not really a shift in power in terms of whose knowledge counts and how it counts in the education of teachers. So what it is including voices and perspectives that are mainly not included now. I think one fundamental important part of this work is relationships, mutually respectful relationships. As one of my students used the term confianza, Latino term for describing the sort. It underlies all this. It's not just the outward nature of this. Trying to recognize that we can't agree on everything, but what can we agree on to move forward, to keep the sight on what the goal is, improving education for children, not arguing with each other over who's right, but moving forward, so that teachers have access to the knowledge and expertise from schools, from the universities, and from the local communities. There are a lot of people out there that believe that we in universities shouldn't be there. You know, they talk about us as an industry of mediocrity. We should go away. We've had a monopoly and let the entrepreneurs come in and do a better job. I think from what I've seen of the programs, I think we do have some things to offer, but we need to offer it in a different way and recognize in a more deeper way what others have to offer. And so in the field of preparing teachers, we have seen a number of things. Many programs have advisory councils that include community members. They meet a few times every year. Many times it's just people talking at the advisory councils. Here's what we've done, here's what we've done. And then there's a few questions and then they go away and come back 6 months later. That's one level of involvement in the community in preparing teachers. There's a need, and there are examples of educating the faculty who educate the teachers about the communities they're preparing those teachers to go teach in. And I would argue that's an important role for the communities in preparing teachers. And then there's the effort that people in communities, family members, community educators, community leaders have things that teachers need they know things about the communities that these teachers are coming into that we need to figure out how to give our new teachers access to. And then this work that's gone on for a number of years, and again, it's the minority of programs that have done it, include a variety of things. I remember back in Wisconsin, there was an example I remember where people from some little town in Wisconsin were bused into Milwaukee for a day to fulfill, there was a state requirement for an urban experience. And that's sort of one extreme level of a surface level experience. There are examples in some programs of courses actually building in assignments that students need to implement with families, in communities. There are programs like the Teacher Corps and others that I've studied where students are required to live in the communities that they're learning to teach in and learn from the communities, and then how to learn about communities and bring that back into the classroom no matter where they go. So I studied students out on the Navajo Reservation, for example, in a program from Indiana University, many of whom left the Navajo Reservation after this cultural immersion experience and would go back to places like Indianapolis and so on. But the argument was that they would develop cultural sensitivities and skills in learning about whatever community they were going to, that they would carry on with them. And again, an important part of learning from communities when you're learning to be a teacher is developing relationships, trusting relationships with families, reaching out in positive ways to families. And it was certainly true in my own career as a white teacher teaching in an African-American community. It didn't matter where I came from, which was Philadelphia, going to a predominantly African-American high school. I was just another white person coming into this community, and they had experienced, there was a lot of hostility about people coming in and then exploiting the communities, and so I needed to prove myself, establish my credibility, and that was important to my ability to succeed as a teacher. And there are different ways to think about it. You know, what are we talking about? For many teachers, and this came up in our research that we did on the work that we're doing at Washington, many people come into teacher ed programs, this is not even on their radar, that working with families and learning about communities is something they need to do. We were told over and over again, given the work that we had done, that they never thought that that was something they need to think about, or that parents are seen as obstacles to the work of teachers and you need to keep them out. That's certainly a view. Most of the literature in the field talks about involvement, family involvement, community involvement. And so what that has come to me, it's a very school-centered view of who has expertise. And what family involvement, community involvement often means is how to better communicate what we know to the families. The progress of their students, how to help them at home, and so on. And there's some value to that, but it doesn't recognize that there's knowledge and expertise in families that teachers need to learn. And that's where family engagement comes in. It sort of flips it and says, it's not only a matter of how to better communicate things from the teacher to the school. Matt's teacher residency has a book called, I think it's called Phoning Parents, which is like all these steps to better communicate outwards. It's learning and listening to the families, the parents, and having that inform your teaching. I have 3 sons. They went through public schools in Wisconsin. Many parent conferences that my wife and I had. I can, on one hand, less than one handful, remember the times when teachers actually cared, asked us what we thought about something. It was mostly just talking at us. And so even though both of us had been teachers and sort of knew the game of teaching, we were still disempowered. And so that effect of disempowerment is multiplied for, new immigrant families who come in, and oftentimes their English is non-existent and it's communicated through an interpreter or limited. It's not only bringing the community in, but the way in which it's done is crucial. Solidarity of families and communities. That recognizes that there already is in communities work going on to better living conditions, to bring more justice to communities. Communities are already organized, and that we as teachers are coming in, that we're part of a larger constellation of effort to work for greater justice. And that's another thing that we've tried with our teacher ed students to help them see. This idea of just going in and having high expectations and being persistent, and all that's important, but they're part of something broader, and they need to understand that, and working in solidarity. So when the teachers go on strike, you have the parents in some places are out there feeding them, giving them food during the strike, and when the parents are protesting a living wage, we just established a $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle, first city in the country. The teachers need to be out there supporting that efforts for more affordable housing. And so it's teachers need to join, and educators, including us in the universities, a broader social movement working for greater justice. This work, I just want to mention a couple of the complications here. I've been going on and on about involving communities. Like, who is the community? What is the community? That's not so straightforward. And people have thought about that in different ways. A number of the examples of programs around the country have partnered with particular neighborhoods. Program in Chicago, for instance, the Chicago Teachers Pipeline partners with 3 particular neighborhoods. There's one in Muncie, Indiana, with Ball State, partners with one neighborhood. I had over 200 teacher ed students who were all over King County, not just in Seattle, many different neighborhoods, and so I had to make decisions about what is the community in the particular context, what community do we want to engage in the preparation of teachers, and I made a choice to go broad rather than based on geographical location. And so I partnered with a group of community activists who were working across the region in helping parents deal with the public school system in terms of some of the things their kids experienced in schools. And when they came to me and said, we want to get to these new teachers before they come out and create some of these problems, I started working with them, and one of the reasons I decided to, one, they had credibility. I couldn't go out there and ask people myself. I was new in the area. Second, they had access to a broad range of communities, people with PhDs, people who hadn't graduated high school, people from different generations. So we involved a lot of different people for different particular purposes. And so we had a very broad view. But it's not straightforward who the community is and needs to be thought about. And the other thing, I alluded to it before, involving communities in participating in the education of teachers or in schools can be a form of greater social control, a new form of colonizing communities from universities, where it's more subtle what's going on, because on the surface, people are coming to meetings and they're included at that level, but when you actually look at whose knowledge counts and how does it count, when people sit down together, oftentimes there's a disempowerment process that takes place, and the same hierarchies of knowledge and power continue to exist under the guise of community participation. And so this is, not something straightforward. It's very complicated. And then I'm not going to go into many of these, but there are a number of, I think, at this current time, really wonderful examples of programs that are people who are doing things. Loyola University has an example where they partner with a Native American community-based organization. In Chicago, that's done some wonderful work. Indiana University's projects that I studied in the 90s are still going on today. Ball State in Muncie, the Chicago Teacher Pipeline in Illinois State is another example. And then these are examples of universities reaching out to communities. There's also another kind of community involvement, and those are ones that originate from the communities. I'll give 2 examples. One is the Logan Square Neighborhood Association in Chicago, started a mentoring program to get immigrant mothers mostly into schools, working in the classrooms. Some of those mothers decided they wanted to be teachers, and so they reached out to some universities to help them start a Grow Your Own program. They wanted to start growing their own teachers who lived in the community, who cared about it, and they wanted to stay there. There's another program like that in British Columbia, a northern neighbor, that was started by First Nations peoples, and they reached out to the University of British Columbia. And but the ownership of these two programs is in the community, and that's a different type of program than ones of universities reaching out to communities. There are a lot of different names for this stuff. I'm not going to get into that. My favorite name, which is not even up here, is Family and School Focused Teacher Education. That makes the point that families are an important part of this. It's not just some nebulous, community out there, but there are families of students. And then there's a lot of research that exists. This is one of the few areas of research, and I'm not going to get into it today, where there's actually strong evidence that this kind of work matters under certain conditions. That if this work is done right, it has a positive effect, at least on the attitudes and beliefs of teachers going into schools, many of them urban schools. And that is that you have to do this work carefully. You have to mediate it, as they say. You can't just send people out to communities and expect they're going to, actually there's research that shows if you just send people out to communities and teacher ed programs, it sometimes strengthens and reinforces the stereotypes they had before they went in, and it can actually make things worse. This work has to be done very carefully. They have to begin to develop relationships, trusting relationships with families. But we don't know much in the literature about how does this actually affect the way people teach. And we've done some of that research in Washington. But most of the research that exists is very strong evidence. There's not much strong evidence in teacher education research for people who know it. I produced for American Educational Research Association. It was like a 1,000-page book on research and teacher education. And the question, what do we know? Not much. In fact, the focus of that 1,000-page book was on how we should do research in the future to actually know more. But engaging communities in preparing teachers under certain carefully constructed conditions, there is strong research that supports it. I want to say a little bit about the work that we've done, just give you as an example. This is my campus outside the education building in March when the cherry blossoms are in bloom. The rain's still there. There's no rain on this particular day. They don't want to put that one on their webpage. But so this was a relatively sunny day for Seattle in March when they come out. The work that we've done at University of Washington draws very heavily on the work of Peter Morrell, who was a teacher educator for a number of years in Wisconsin, in Boston, and at the end of his career in Baltimore. And he was a strong advocate for the role of communities in preparing teachers. And he came up with this notion of community teachers. And so that's a concept we talk to our teacher education students about, that we want to prepare them to be community teachers and have them do a lot of thinking about where they are and what their role is in the context they're in. They see students as members of families and cultural communities. They work to connect their classrooms to community knowledge and resources and to community organizations. And they see their work, again, as part of this broader constellation of effort in communities, and they recognize what others in the community are doing that are complementary to this. They see themselves working with and for communities instead of trying to save students from communities. And so this is a concept that is central to the work that we've done. When I arrived in Seattle in 2009, there existed something, of the work that's been done, and there hasn't been a whole lot of it, but of the work that has been done, most of it has been putting teacher ed students in community-based organizations And many times they end up tutoring kids after school, like with their homework and so on. And they're not really interacting with families, and they're not really out in the community learning about it. So when I arrived there, this existed, and then for a variety of reasons, it ended. And the other thing about what I had heard was that many of the organizations were not in the neighborhoods of the schools where they were placed for the whole year. It didn't make much sense to me. So they would be in a school, and they spent a whole year in one particular school in their post-bac program, and then they would drive to a community-based organization in the other part of town, which for many of them was an aggravation. I think we have the second worst traffic problem in the United States. And some of us kept, we need to have, why not just in the community where they're learning to teach? So that was gone, and we decided to create something else. And so I partnered with this group of community activists, and we began, I brought them in, and they helped plan and create a series of learning activities in 3 of our teacher education programs that included a number of things. This is that same center, El Centro de la Raza. This is part of our secondary cohort. You can't see them all. There's 65 of them, going to interact with the staff at El Centro about the work that they do and why they do it regards to the education of Latino students in the city. So they don't have a placement there, but they're in there learning from the community educators about the work that they do. We bring groups into classes. And so this is something, the engagement of communities, that's not sitting out there in isolation, but we try to tie it into different classes in the program. And so this is the Council of American Islamic Relations talking in one of our classes. The important thing about this is that the community leaders are at the table planning this work, evaluating this work with us. It's not just bringing people in. And everything is debriefed, and so there's sort of a learning curve, but they're part of that instructional team. And they're paid for doing that. It's not volunteer work. We have, and my community partners call it a first touch on certain issues. We have a variety of panels where we bring everybody together, usually out in the community somewhere, in a school or community center. This is a panel, I think in our elementary program, where various members are talking about their experiences with the schools in the area, the public schools, as parents, as uncles or aunts, what kinds of experiences they have and what kinds of experiences would they hope that their family members would get. And so these people were selected with the community leaders, and the teacher educators sit down and select the people in relationship to the topic. And then there's a debriefing and small group discussion that goes along with it, as well as preparing the candidates to go in and learn from this experience. There's also one on the school-to-prison pipeline, or disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline, that we do pretty regularly. And this is a photo from the debriefing following one of those panels, where we have a variety of people who work in the juvenile justice system, people who have lived the school-to-prison pipeline. President of our local NAACP spent 26 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. And they're talking to the candidates about, one, enlarging their awareness of what actually is happening in this country, and second, trying to talk to them about what can you do as teachers to help disrupt this. And so this woman over here on the right is a principal in the Seattle Public Schools, and in this large room in a high school in the Central District are teacher ed students, teacher ed faculty, some classroom teachers and principals, and community mentors talking about this issue. And then we break down, we have smaller, more intimate conversations in individual regional areas, different parts of the city and the county, where community mentors go in and they work with candidates in smaller groups and more deeply to try to talk to them like issues about how to talk about racism in the classroom, how to reach out to families, because a lot of these candidates really are unfamiliar with the kinds of communities they're in. And so these community members are giving them guidance and advice. And what they tell them right up front is that they're here because they want their kids to get a good education. And they say to them, well, if you do a good job, my kids are going to get educated. I'm not here to they share some of the stories of things they've experienced, but the focus is on how to have teachers going in positioned in a way to work with communities. And we did a bunch of research on this that I'm not going to go into today that included going into the first year of teaching for some of the candidates and looking at, okay, what were they actually doing after they left the teacher education program? And what we found that mostly they're out there practicing what they're doing. The sad part of it is that they were going into schools that were not necessarily welcoming the kind of work they wanted to do. And there were a couple kinds of reactions. One was, you're crazy doing all this extra work for which you're not being paid. And that's an issue for teachers, going out and doing these family visits and so on. And then the other one was some candidates talking to us about working undercover as community teachers because they didn't want to sort of promote what they were doing as first-year teachers. They wanted to continue doing it, but they were worried about some of the environments they were in were very highly controlling and not very hospitable to reaching out to communities. But we found a lot of people doing things, and then we bring those people back to talk to students in the program about how they do those things in environments that require them working against the grain to do these things. And so that is a continual problem. And then there are certain characteristics of the program that facilitated them coming on board and really seeing this as important work. Probably the most powerful thing that they experienced was the interaction with the community mentors. They would tell us it was the passion and the authenticity of what these parents and community leaders were saying to them that really convinced them of the importance. In a number of cases, it had an effect we call peeling the onion, where it wasn't just a matter of reaching out to families is important, learning about the community is important, but it began a questioning of oneself that I think is very important for many of the teachers coming in to teach who are teaching in communities that their own life experience it's foreign to what they've experienced. And so the interaction with community mentors caused a sort of realization of privileges that they've had that they've never thought about, and questioning of some of the things they've come to believe. And the other part of this, there were also many tensions within the academy that I think from people who have tried to do this work have come up. It's very hard in a university environment, particularly a research university like this one or my own, to bring people in from outside and have them considered as equals in terms of being involved in the planning, conceptualizing, being listened to. Professors like to talk a lot. And so we talk at people a lot, but we don't have enough, I think, humility to listen to people and to work in ways where we're not doing all the talking and shaping everything. And some of the personal dynamics that have existed in my experience, both in Washington and Madison, Wisconsin, and in other programs that I observed are problems. Other problems are, how do you fund this work? Again, teacher ed doesn't consider it important. And so where do the resources come? Public universities like mine have lost a lot of resources. in my own experience, what I did was use the Boeing money that I have. So Boeing Corporation was paying for seeding of some of this work. I used that to pay, and it wasn't that expensive. You know, I was being criticized for spending all this money on community mentors, and I could hire, for all the money I spent in a year to run this in 3 programs and bring in 70 community mentors not affiliated with the schools or the university. It cost me approximately the same amount of money as it did to hire one 50% teaching assistant in the university. And so there was this sort of talk in the hallways about, you know, all this stuff that I'm doing, and I'm trying to subvert the authority of the faculty. And, you know, there are issues related to power that aren't easy to deal with. I think one of my big mistakes, and if I had it to do again, I didn't spend enough time bringing the community mentors to work with the faculty and having them develop trusting relationships with each other ahead of time. Because when I had this previous program dumped on me, I felt an obligation to the 200 and some students in the programs I was responsible for, not to wait 2 years and plan something, but to try to pick up. So we tried to build it as the bus was going down the highway. And we needed to spend more time so that the faculty and the community mentors trusted each other more. There was a lot of criticism of the mentors that all they do is tell stories. And I said, yes, those stories, actually, I have data I can show you that those stories are actually the things that are moving the students and really helping to transform their view of the role of teacher to include this element. And if you want them to act like, there's no point in bringing them in to act like us. They bring different things. And the teachers that I was trying to bring in, they also bring things. And so we need to recognize in the academy that we can't do the job alone. And that's hard in the university culture to do that. And in many university cultures. So it's an issue. So what have I learned from this so far in my experiences here and in Wisconsin in trying to do this work? So just putting students out in schools more and in communities, that doesn't tell you anything. It's like what happens when they're there and how it's guided and mediated. Second, it's something that you're never fully achieving. It's like this utopian vision of this 3.0 is an ideal vision of the way things should be that you're never going to achieve. And so the goal is to keep working toward that. And again, I don't want to underemphasize the complexity of this work because it's really, really hard. And being able to do this work at scale, I think, is something that nobody's been able to do. So all the examples I flashed on the screen of current programs, all the examples that I can think of work in the past, they've been short-term projects dependent upon particular people, dependent upon particular grants. This has not been internalized as this is the way we prepare teachers, that communities have a right to be part of the preparation of teachers of their children. And they've been small, like Ball State University has a wonderful program with a neighborhood in Muncie, Indiana. They graduate approximately 2,000 teachers a year at Ball State. There are 20 students of those 2,000 who get to participate in their Schools Within Community project. There are no examples that I can think of in the last 40 years of programs that lasted over time, that scaled up to be able to do this in some of the state universities like Illinois State and the large former normal schools that prepare a lot of teachers, a couple thousand. City University in New York, I think Queens College is one of the largest producers. And so we have this real problem of how do you move toward normalizing this work in education of teachers. And it's important to do it in the education of teachers because if you want to make schools more community responsive, you have to have teachers in them that are committed to that. And so we had Covello and Dillard, two principals that were able to do that. We need to be able to do that again on a wide scale so that it becomes the norm in teacher ed. It's hard work. I can't, it's really difficult to do. But this parachuting of teachers in communities to save children, in the end, I actually think will widen gaps and opportunities to learn rather than help them. I think it's really counterproductive, this idea of sending people in who have no commitment to the community, maybe to individual kids, but again, kids live in families and in communities, and teachers have to have a broader commitment. And again, and I said this in the beginning, let's not pretend that any of this work, even the community work, is going to be enough. And this idea of education reform being linked up with broader social reform in terms of a social movement for greater social justice. And most of all, we in the universities need to actually practice what we say is important, and we need to be doing these things ourselves. If we want teachers to be community teachers, we need to be community teacher educators, or it won't happen. But I do have a few ideas about, after 40 years of struggling with work like this, after studying and admiring others who have tried to do it, and seeing some amazing things around the country. One of the things I believe that needs to be done is the investment of more resources. Teacher ed mostly takes place in public universities that are starved for resources. They're struggling now even without this. And so if you want this work to happen, there needs to be resources added to help it happen. And I'm not talking about short-term grants. The work that was going on at Washington before I got there, one of the reasons it ended, it was operating on a grant from the Ford Foundation. When I got there, there were some grad students who were still working on it, but they were volunteering their time because there was no money to pay them. But they believed in the work. We need to say that if it's important, it means you put resources behind it. One of the things historically, the federal government has had a large influence in the past on when they give out funding requiring certain things. Most recently, it was Race to the Top. If you want Race to the Top money in the different states and so on, you do these things. You let in non-university teacher ed programs. You do this, you that. The teacher corps, and if you want teacher corps money, Head Start money, there were a number of federal programs in Lyndon Johnson's programs that required community participation. It's not enough. It doesn't speak to the issue of how are they engaged in it. But I think we need to, give more money, but have strings attached to it. I just put $25,000 from the chair that I have, even though I'm not to support community engagement work in our teacher education programs this year, but I have some strings attached. I want the community members at the table planning and conceptualizing the work, and I wrote a narrative that asked for certain conditions. I don't want to give money to support just bringing people in token ways that more subtly control them because it's under the guise of participation. I think we need to hire community-based teacher educators who are on the staff and there all the time. This can't be operated just by having, and that was my goal in this work, but I never achieved it, to have people on the staff as members of the faculty from the community sort of orchestrating the work, but they're there over the long term, rather than just people coming in from the outside. That's another way to take it seriously. I think the states have control over teacher ed programs. They have all sorts of standards we need to meet. I think building into those standards some accountability for engaging communities in particular ways is something that we were certainly responsible for in the teacher corps, but needs to be there now. programs are not going to pay attention to it unless they're held accountable for it. And I think there needs to be greater accountability. And finally, I think local communities need to put pressure on their teacher education programs to be stepping up and doing this work. And there are a couple of examples just from my recent times. The American tribal leaders, the American Indian tribal leaders in Washington, calling the dean in and saying, you know, this is what we think of the teachers you're sending out. And you bet, you know, just constant pressure. One of the first things, we hired a new dean, Mia Twan, recently, she's very much committed to equity and in the work that she does. But one of the first things she experienced was a meeting with myself and the community leaders that I partnered with and the chair of education in the local NAACP, telling her that this is what's going on. You're not giving the teachers these things that they need. And we're going to come back in 6 months and check up on what you're doing. And they go back periodic, putting the pressure from the community on the teacher preparation programs. I think it's very important. But I don't, again, have the answers to this, but I think it's something in schooling and in preparation of teachers that eventually we need to figure out how to do, because I look back over the last 40 years and the problems that drove me to public education to begin with. They're not only still there, in some cases they're larger than they were when I started out. And a lot of the problem has been the failure to listen to and engage communities. Just final word, and I'll shut up. Peering at me. There was a book called The Prize. I don't know how many of you read it, that was written about Mark Zuckerberg gave $100 million to Newark Public Schools, and then there was a matching grant that went with it. And so the reporter went in to figure out, like, what happened with this $200 million, and the answer was not much. And in this book, The Prize, which I would recommend, which I think it was a series of articles in the New Yorker that was turned into the book, one of the major problems with throwing all this money into Newark was the people who lived there and sent their kids to schools were not included in more than surface ways. Nobody listened to what they thought the problems were. Nobody engaged them in helping to create the solutions. So we see over and over again that the failure to do this leads to failure in the reforms. And we see over and over again in programs like James Comer's, and there are others like that, that when you do it, education is improved for kids in urban schools. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a question or two, a few questions. Is there a question? If you have a question, please stand and please tell us who you are and pose the question right here.
My name is Zeichner. I'm a member of the CUEtalks program here, so I'm an undergraduate, and I wanted to know what advice you had for future and current teachers in public school settings that are against this kind of policy. What do you give us as advice for going into centers that are against this?
Well, I think graduates of programs that prepare them to be community teachers going to schools where that's not common. I think what I tell teacher candidates is that they need to work strategically to push this work. One, they need to, even though teachers may not be doing it or teaching in the ways that they're teaching, they have things to learn from them. That was one of the problems with Teacher Corps. They went in, they wanted to blow up the whole system, and everybody was bad, and they didn't. And so the end result was not much impact on either ed schools or the public schools. And so they need to go in and work against the grain, and that's actually a component of our program, is to teach them, one, about what the reality is. And it's true that teachers are not paid. There's a reason why teachers sometimes are hostile to things like family visits. But they need to go in and begin to do this work. One strategy is to tie it to the existing things they're required to do. So the folks telling me they're working undercover said they're framing it in terms of the Danielson framework, which is used to evaluate teachers. They're tying it to Common Core, and they're also engaging families in their curriculum and developing these relationships. So you do it in a way that's not going to alienate people. and that over time people begin to see what happens, and they notice, like, they have one school there was this instance of they couldn't get parents to come out for events, and some of our community teacher graduates organized some events, and they had to go bring chairs from other parts of the building because there were so many people that turned out. Others noticed things like that. And then the other thing, is beginning to focus, like on our residency program, we're focusing on feeding the graduates into certain schools, certain Title I schools, and you begin to create a critical mass in buildings where you begin to shift what's considered normal. And eventually you might get to the point that I was faced with when I went in, that this is the way we do things here. If you don't like it, go teach somewhere else. But I liked it. But it takes time, and you have to be very strategic. Teaching is inherently a political act. It takes place in the context of this organization, the school, and so you need to, and so we try to help our teacher candidates be thoughtful about how they do that. It's not just, sometimes they get all these practices, research-based practices, and they come out and they're told in their classes that this is what you should be doing, and then they go out, and for a variety of reasons, they don't see them going on. Teachers are mandated to do other things, the emphasis on standardized testing and NCLB. There are a lot of reasons that teachers are doing what they're doing, and they have the tendency to criticize the teachers. I don't think there's anything to be gained by that. It's trying to take the long-term view and work toward, but in terms of your own classroom, doing the work, and trying to get the union to bargain for support for things like family visits and so on, and training to be able to do that well. Yeah, somebody asked me that earlier in a meeting, and as I said earlier, the idea of who is the community is different in different contexts, and in that case, it's the families of your students and the communities where they live in, and certainly it's more complicated to go out to 8 communities, but there are things you could probably do connecting with the families and learning about bringing people from the communities together to learn about the resources. There are things that could be done that would be different than my experience being in one community. But I think it's possible to do it. I mean, Dillard, I forget the square miles that were involved in Caswell County, North Carolina, but that was like a large area with people in town, out of town, and he developed this method of community-centered education in that large geographic area. And so I think you just have to think about it in a different way.
Is there one more question?
Well, there have been examples, including in my own state, of families suing the state for lack of access to a quality education. There's a case right now, the McCleary decision in Washington, where the Supreme Court of the state ruled in favor of the family. And the state of Washington is being fined $100,000 a day until they start providing an equal education to all students. Yeah, I mean, the narrowing of the curriculum in certain communities has been a real problem. Those communities also have less access to fully prepared and experienced teachers. We have a very inequitable distribution of teachers in the United States. But I still think that the ideas that I've been talking about are relevant. Dealing with the policymakers, that's another talk there in terms of how to influence them to support it. But I still think it's important in terms of example of how do you grow teachers when they haven't access to the courses. There are many grow your own programs. My oldest son is a teacher in Seattle, and he's about to begin working with a local community college to begin a pipeline program into teaching in a particular community that begins in high school, to try to get with and mentor and bring people along. The Logan Square program in Chicago is another example of a program that they don't come in with bachelor's degree. They come in and sort of, there's a lot of things we've learned about how to create those programs so that they're successful, that include the kinds of conditions that you've been talking about. And so I think those programs are very important, the Grow Your Own programs. Yeah, I mean, the one that I just referred to that my son's involved with Highline Community College is in an urban area. Not in the city, but in an urban area where people have been pushed out because the housing prices in the city. And so it's mostly high poverty and segregated. Segregation now is greater than it was back in the 1960s. And so there is... I think that's a strategy that can be pursued as not the only strategy, and that we've learned a lot of things collectively about how to do that well, what kinds of supports need to be provided to the community members to enable them to complete a program like that, to become teachers in their community. There's a whole history of things, and it's a more complicated effort than just having people come to classes in a university like this in a program. You have to do a lot more things, given the circumstances that they're living in and their financial resources. But again, they're good examples of those programs, and I think that's the other part of it. I didn't really talk about it today. So we need to grow teachers in communities who want to be there, who are going to stay there, and we're always going to have people coming in from the outside. And so what I was talking about, what we need to do to focus on people coming in from the outside to disrupt this pattern of people coming in and not seeing themselves in relationship to the communities they're working in. I think it's disrespectful, and it doesn't contribute to building capacity in those communities.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Dr. Zeichner.
All right, you better get going before you lose them.
All right, the lecture is not over, so please don't leave. Don't leave. We actually still have some other parts of the program, and we hope you will stay with us. Dr. Heather Cunningham will now join me to introduce a student group to the front. Dr. Cunningham.
Hi, everybody. So, before joining the University of Pittsburgh, I was a classroom teacher at City Charter High School. And located in downtown Pittsburgh, City High students learn typical high school subjects such as math and English, but are also required to take other classes that give them skills that jobs of today require, like HTML coding and video production and Microsoft Excel. I wish I had the tech skills that these ladies have over here. It is my pleasure to also introduce ladies that I know will delight you with their musical performance this evening. Directed by their teacher, Mr. Brian Sable, I'd like to introduce the City Charter High School Choir.
Good evening, and thank you to Dr. Zeichner and to Dr. Milner in the Center for Urban Education. We've prepared a 2-hour-long program for you. All Gregorian chant you're going to love. Actually, this group is not very representative of our population. Contrary to what it looks like, we are not an all-girls school. I get a brand new bunch of students every 13 weeks, and it just so happened that this time they were all young ladies. But don't let that fool you, because you're going to be hearing us singing parts, 3- and 4-part harmony, things that were originally written for SATB choirs, but we are doing them in SSA versions. We have 3 pieces ready for you tonight. The first is Da Pacem Domine, which for the music nerds is a double fugue. Go home, look it up. And then we have a piece entitled Dream a Dream, and then our last piece for you will be Seasons of Love from the musical Rent.
true.
In closing, how many of you are brand new to the choir at City High? So these kids, we get a new batch of students every 13 weeks. We are on a trimester schedule, which is one thing that makes us a very unique public charter school. So we do not follow a traditional academic calendar. With that being said, these kids have only been singing together for the last 7 weeks. So it's pretty astounding that they've memorized these pieces, and I just want to give them a big shout out. You guys rock. Thank you.
So thank you so much from all of us at the Center for Urban Education. On behalf of the University of Pittsburgh Center for Urban Education, we thank you, City Charter High School Choir, ladies, for sharing your talents with us in the Spring 2017 Q Lecture Series, Thursday, February 23rd, 2017. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. These students are great examples of the incredibly talented students we are fortunate to work with through our work here at the Center for Urban Education. I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the people who keep CUE going. Thank you especially to the Heinz Endowments, the Grable Foundation, the Year of Diversity, and the McGrevin Family Fund for supporting the work we do. And because people are central to our work in the center, I would like to acknowledge some people who support the center in extraordinarily important ways. I'd like to ask for the core members of the Center for Urban Education leadership team to please stand and now be recognized. Thank you. Would the following groups please stand and be recognized at this time? Please hold your applause until all groups have actually stood. The Center for Urban Education Faculty Fellows, please stand. Center for Urban Education Faculty Fellows. Remain standing. Don't clap, don't clap, don't clap. The Center for Urban Education Graduate Student Fellows, please stand, please stand. Don't clap yet. The Ready to Learn undergraduate and high school scholars, please stand, please stand. And the School of Education Urban Scholars, supported through the Center for Urban Education. Please stand and be recognized. All right, turn around and look at these folks, Ken. I want you to see these folks here, all right? All right, now you may applaud. When the center was founded in 2002, it was because of the vision and commitment of our former dean, Alan Lesko. Please stand, Alan. He just stepped out, okay. Wouldn't you know it? In his honor, the Alan Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education is presented to an educator, leader, or community member who demonstrates outstanding work and commitment to innovation and improvement in urban education. Today, we are fortunate to honor two individuals whose work exemplifies this commitment. This evening's first recipient is a true champion of urban education in Pittsburgh, Mr. Jason Rivers. Jason Rivers makes a transformative impact on his community as the co-founder of AR3, a movement of healing, forgiveness, and atonement which began as a summer basketball league and has evolved into a restorative justice movement in the city of Pittsburgh. Jason started the league with the slogan, "It's bigger than basketball," as a way of constructively channeling his family's trauma over the loss of his brother, Anthony Rivers, to gun violence. AR3's mission is to uplift, unify, and strengthen the community. For the past 8 years, Jason has used AR3 to bring community members, families, and organizations together to have real dialogue about issues of life. Jason has earned the respect of the community through servant leadership, modeling an unwavering belief in the potential of his people. His attempts to boldly address and interrupt the racist, institutionalized practices that plague his community, city, and nation, and he tries to empower others to do the same. Jason also serves as a project manager for the We Promise program, a mentoring program aimed at increasing the GPA and attendance of Black male students in Pittsburgh public schools. In this role, he works to establish a network of successful Black men who support PPS scholars in reaching their full potential. Under Jason's co-leadership, We Promise has increased the number of Black male students eligible to receive the Pittsburgh Promise Scholarship. Jason also serves in the district as a racial equity affiliate and is known for his strength and passion as a facilitator of equity-focused professional development. Jason says his work would not be possible without the love, drive, and support of his family and strength of his ancestors. His wife, Carla, wave Carla, and their 7 children. Are the 7 children here? Wave 7 children. All right. His mother, wave mother. I see the mother. Brother, and a host of other family members are pillars in his village. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for the 2017 Allen Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education to Mr. Jason Rivers. Our second Let's Go Award recipient focuses on urban education from a different perspective. Ms. Lynn Hayes Freeland. You may applaud. You may clap for her. Lynn Hayes Freeland is a general assignment reporter known for live late-breaking reporting for KDKA TV News. She is also a producer and host of the award-winning show The Lynn Hayes Freeland Show, a weekly half-hour program that focuses on African-American issues. When Shelley and I visited Pittsburgh for one of the first times, we were actually here house hunting 4 years ago, I remember watching your show, Lynn, and at that particular moment, you were actually interviewing our dean, Allen Lesko. And I thought, and I've tuned into your show ever since, and you know, your work has truly been educational on every level that I can think of. The Lynn Hayes Freeland Show provides a forum for discussion of the challenges facing racially diverse school districts, educating teachers on racially sensitive techniques, and looking at disparities in the classroom and their long-term effects. The show provides one of the few local commercial outlets for exploring studies of how children facing racial and social economic challenges learn. She began her broadcasting career at WDUQ Radio as the host of Sunday Night Jazz. After joining KDKA TV, she worked as a field producer for the Evening Magazine show. She served as the creating producer of Weekend Magazine, a weekly 2-hour public affairs program focused on religion, politics, and women's issues. Lynn Hayes Freeland has built a 40-year career around serving her community with a special emphasis on children. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for the 2017 Allen Lesko Award recipient, Lynn Hayes Freeland. Okay, so before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our colleague, Dr. Ashley Woodson, whose work and voice, is she in the room? Okay, she's nodding, but she's in the room. Dr. Ashley Woodson, whose work and voice have been incredibly valuable to CUE as an advisory board member, a faculty fellow, and for the last year as a member of our core leadership team in the Center for Urban Education. In addition to being one of the most promising scholars in the field, that's right, I said it, she has a dynamic personality who brings levity to what can be difficult topics and conversations. Dr. Woodson is leaving at the end of this academic year to pursue an opportunity at the University of Missouri. While we'll miss her dearly, we're excited for her, her family, and to see her take the next steps in her career. And we're beyond grateful for all she's done for us. When I met Ashley about 4 years ago, I'm not gonna cry. Y'all want me to cry? I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna do it. But when I met Ashley 4 years ago, as a budding assistant professor, I knew at that moment that we had something special here at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm very excited and very grateful to her for all she's done to make CUE what it is. She is a powerhouse in her own right, and wherever she goes, I know that space will be enriched and enlightened by that work. So we just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge you, to be clear, as I would say, that you are a game changer and a dream keeper, as my good colleague Gloria Lasson-Billings would say. So please join me here up front. Ashley Whitson.
Hi, I am Lori DeLaley O'Connor, one of the Associate Directors at CUE, and this time we really are almost done. We thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. We appreciate that you come to all of our events, that you support, that you care about this community and about education in this community. I just want to remind you or tell you for the first time about a few things that we have coming up, so hopefully you'll join us again. First, immediately following, as we move into sort of a reception phase, I'm sure you're all hungry and thirsty. If you're a teacher and you'd like to earn 5 ACT 48 credits, you can meet some of my colleagues across the hall in room 107 for a post-lecture discussion. So some of you here have already signed up, but even if you haven't, that is okay. You can go to room 107. It will run from 6:15 to 7:15 and is a great opportunity to talk about a lot of what Dr. Zeichner talked to us about and to think about that in your classroom and in your practice. Another thing that we have coming up, particularly for those of you who are here, but tell your friends who weren't unable to join us, we always follow our lecture with a reflection into action. We see that as a space where we can move what Dr. Zeichner talked about into action in the Pittsburgh community. So some of the questions that were asked and some of the questions that I'm sure are in your heads really are about how this could impact your practice and your school and your neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And we intend to have that discussion next Thursday, March 2nd, from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, which is on Highland Avenue. So please join us, and even, as I said, if your colleagues were unable to be here, they could still be an active part of that conversation. And then finally, please save the date. This will be our 2nd annual Summer Educator Forum, and more details will follow. But for the time being, think about the dates of June 20th and 21st is already reserved for that professional development experience. So we hope that you will all join us and grab a bite to eat for the reception out in the hallway. And thank you again for being here.